Hi, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Wild Ones National Webinar, EcoBeneficial Landscaping Strategies for the Climate Crisis with Kim Eierman. I'm Sarah Ressing, Wild Ones Education and Program Coordinator, and I'm excited to host you. But before we jump in, a few quick notes. Our webinar here is hosted on YouTube Live, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If you'd like to hide the chat, you can enter full screen mode. Closed captioning is also available in your settings, and you can pause or rewind using the controls at the bottom of the player. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Wild Ones channel for more great content. For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we are a nonprofit membership organization devoted to promoting native plants and natural landscapes through education, advocacy, and collaborative action. Our mission comes to life through the grassroots efforts of local Wild Ones chapters, along with national programs and resources like this webinar. If you're not a Wild Ones member, we hope you will join us in helping native plants and natural landscapes thrive in every community. At the local level, our chapters offer knowledgeable, hands-on, and supportive communities. Chapter programs include garden tours, speakers, conferences, as well as plant sales, exchanges, and seed collection. Local chapters are a great place to network and work with other nature enthusiasts to learn more about native plants. And finally, programs like this one would not be possible without the generous support of all of you. So please consider donating to Wild Ones today. Wild Ones' vision is native plants and natural landscapes in every community, and your donation will help us reach that goal. Beyond donations, there's so many ways you can contribute to the Wild Ones mission. You can volunteer at the local or national level, certify your native habitat, or dive into our recommended reading list. Every action helps make a difference in creating a healthy planet. Visit wildones.org to learn more and get involved. And now I will hand it over to our speaker, Kim Eierman. Welcome, Kim.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Eierman. I'm really happy to join you for this webinar, and thank you to Wild Ones for having me. Appreciate it. I'm a proud member of Wild Ones, and if you're not yet, please join them. So I am an environmental horticulturist as well as an ecological landscape designer, and I'm the founder of a company called EcoBeneficial LLC based in Westchester County, New York. And there's the URL for my website if you're interested in taking a look at some information there, including some interviews with really terrific people in our native plant world. Now, I do a lot of design and implementation work for clients, residential clients, commercial clients, municipal clients on occasion. And I do a lot of teaching. I teach at New York Botanical Garden, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, the Native Plant Center here in New York, Massachusetts Horticultural Society, and Half Moon Education. I really like teaching, and I hope it shows when you listen to this webinar. I do a lot of public speaking nationwide and also actually in Canada. So hope to catch you at one of those events. So today's topic is eco-beneficial landscape strategies for the climate crisis. There used to be a gentler time when we just referred to climate change, and now I think we can all embrace a more serious term, climate crisis. This is an image of one of the wildflower hikes I did in the Smoky Mountains during the annual Smoky Wildflower Pilgrimage, end of April, and an unexpected snowstorm. And boy, we're getting some of that, and actually some periods of winter where we used to have a lot of snow, we have none. So there are a lot of climate change impacts that we can take a look at. Well, of course, we all know global temperature increase is here. Undoubtedly, 2024 was the world's warmest year since records began in 1850, according to NOAA. And for us, gardeners and landscape professionals, we've got to deal with this reality, these extended growing seasons that impact what we do and how we do it. So we are getting earlier springs when there's just not very much out and about. This picture happens to be of a red maple flower, one of our earliest blooming plants in New York where I am in March. There's a honeybee that is going to it. Bumblebees will go to it as well. And we're getting later falls. So important to be thinking about these keystone species like goldenrods and asters at this time of year, and not just one species, but having multiple species in your landscape. So the continuous and extended succession of bloom has never been more important. And this is a concept that I address in my book, The Pollinator Victory Garden, starting to keep a bloom chart, taking a look at different times of year and what you have in bloom and for which pollinators is really crucially important. And thinking about extending that bloom as much as possible and not having bloom gaps for any particular groups of pollinators. So we're getting earlier and more erratic springs, potential frost damage with spring freezes. We've all seen that, I'm sure. Longer growing season results in plant stress and also increased pest activity. And changing phenology being the relationship between climate and periodic biological phenomena like bird migration, the reproduction of amphibians, and plant flowering time. And the natural drivers of phenology include day length, sunlight, temperature, and precipitation. These are things we don't have a lot of control over. So what is resulting with the climate crisis is we're getting these phenology and species mismatches, bird migration, coming back too early. What are the resources that are available for them? That can be a problem. Earlier insect activity, and this could be both pests and beneficials, including early emergence of, say, queen bumblebees, where there's nothing for them to eat. Pollinator activity, as I mentioned, and flowering time, really important. So many of our landscapes don't get started robustly until later in the spring. Start to think about early spring plantings to hopefully feed a lot more pollinators, and also leaving resources standing like seed heads for birds, and thinking about fruiting species of native plants, woodies, trees, shrubs, and vines that provide, excuse me, a winter or early spring resource because it just hasn't been eaten yet. And then in fall, again, we have this species mismatch, right? Bird migration. When do you go? And do we have the appropriate resources for them? Very disturbing. My viburnum dentatum, my arrowwood viburnum, the birds have already eaten all that fruit. It's done. And that happened by the end of August. I was hoping it was going to stay on longer because migrating birds really need that. And by the way, the examples that I'll be using are ones that are native here in the Northeast. I appreciate the fact that many of you are in other parts of the country and potentially other countries as well. So do your research on particular species that are regional where you are. Fall again, we get extended insect activity, and this could be, pests activity on the downside, but also pollinator activity and what's available for pollinators in the late fall when temperatures are still really warm. So in my own landscape, and it's not a big one, I have 5 different species of native asters, and I have 5 different species of native goldenrods, knowing that they don't all feed exactly the same pollinators and they don't all bloom at the exact same time. So really hedging our bets by having more resources available in the climate crisis. Here's an ugly picture. Some invasive plants have a favorable reaction to higher CO2 levels in the face of climate change. And many of you will know this bad boy. This is Japanese knotweed. I call it the Godzilla of invasive plants where we are. And being really thoughtful about invasive removal and spending time doing that. Get them early, get them often, and just keep at it is super important. Many of my clients, this is the last thing they want to do, but it's the first thing that we do in terms of preparing a site. Sometimes I spend many more days doing invasive removal on a landscape than I do actual planting. So invasive removal and replacement with appropriate native species has never been more important. And I'm often asked by students who are trying to get into the industry, maybe changing their careers, where can I make money in horticulture and landscape design? Where do I go? Well, here's a business opportunity. I think this is a fantastic way to make money by having contracts with clients, coming over, say, the course of the growing season monthly and removing the newly emerging invasive plants that weren't deterred the first time. And of course, it's not a one and done with invasive removal. But we got to remove them. So this is Ficaria verna, lesser celandine, something that we see in the New York tri-state area all over the place next to streams. It is really pernicious invasive. So getting a handle on this, it's rhizomatous, it's a pain, but getting a handle on this and replacing thickly and quickly with competitive natives. In our case, Pecoraria might be one of our choices as a competitive native plant that really is quite ground smothering. We're getting more erratic and unexpected weather in the last decade or last 12 years. I've lost track. Here where I am, we've had 2 major snowstorms in October before our first average frost date, and that can be really problematic for plants. So using more resilient plants, trying to lay off the snow splitters, the ecological laggards like arborvitae would be a really good idea. We're getting an increase in extreme weather events in general, right? Severe droughts, extreme precipitation, coastal flooding, heat waves. It's all happening. I used to have to convince people of this. I don't think I have to convince people so much anymore. But here's a frightening little stat. The amount of rain that falls during the heaviest downpours has increased in the Northeast by approximately 60% since the 1950s. Largest increase in the United States. And I see it. I see these, crazy rain events, and it can be quite challenging for us gardeners and landscape professionals. We have decreased snow cover, and if you're a skier, well, that makes you cry. It makes me cry. But as a gardener, as a landscape professional, this is problematic in areas that used to get regular snow cover. EPA actually states that this lack of snow cover, this decrease in snow cover, has a diminishing beneficial insulating effect of snow for plants and wildlife. And, if you've ever paid attention, snow is a great insulator, but we're just not getting very much of it anymore, at least where I am. We're getting more frequent droughts. Here in New York, we just had 3 days of rainfall of 2 inches after several weeks of nothing. And we need to pay more attention to these periods of drought. We've got the increased risk of plant fatality, obviously, and also reduced seed set. So that's really important, not just to feed birds and other creatures that feed on our native seeds, but also in terms of plant reproduction in our landscapes. I got this email recently from a nursery in Fairfield, Connecticut. Oliver Nurseries. Water your garden. It's desperately dry, and so on and so forth. Thank you for this. We should all be sending this out to clients if we have them. This kind of, wake up. We've got to, water our garden to keep things alive. It's really important. This is not something we had to do, or I didn't have to do 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but we sure have these situations now when it gets pretty dire where we have triage watering. And drought can be, quite problematic for resources. It impacts plant resources. Here's a study you might want to refer to from the Journal of Insect Science. Reduced water negatively impacts social bee survival and productivity via shifts in floral nutrition. So what did they tell us in this study? Well, drought can impact forage, decrease in floral abundance, decrease in nectar quantity, decrease in nectar quality, and a decrease in the protein quality of pollen. Not all pollen is equivalent. What's my message? Do something that we're not used to doing as native gardeners. Water your plants in a drought when you're in a triage situation. Keep the nectar flow going. Keep the pollen quality going for pollinators. They're already in enough trouble. So a little perspective on species decline. This is a quote from the Harvard School of Public Health that's got some age to it, but I think it's still very pertinent. And that is climate change alone is expected to threaten with extinction approximately 1/4 or more of all species on land by the year 2050. We're not far from that. Surpassing even habitat loss as the biggest threat to life on land. Taking this seriously, right? Here's an old cover, right, from the Washington Post. Headline, 1 million species face extinction, UN report says, and humans will suffer as a result. These headlines you just don't see them very often anymore, unfortunately. Here is the Living Planet Index. I liken this to the Dow Jones for vertebrate species. And the last published report that they came out with showed a decline in vertebrate species. Between 1970 and 2020, a decline of 73% for vertebrates. Astounding. And how about decline of birds? So this is a 2019 report in Science, staggering decline of bird populations. A loss of 3 billion birds in North America in 48 years, a decline of 29% of 1970 abundance. And when the State of the Birds report came out, 2025, they said, hey, those losses that were published in 2019, they're continuing. And notably, duck populations, which were strong in that 2019 report, are now rapidly declining. A lot of species at risk, And if you love birds like I do, this breaks your heart and you try to figure out, how can I help? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit. The insect apocalypse is here. This was a headline in the New York Times Magazine section. You don't need a headline. You don't need a cover like this to tell you this is happening. If you've lived for some years on this planet, you think back 20 or 30 years ago and remember what it was like on a warm summer day to go out on a drive at dusk and how much insect splatter you'd get on your car. And now, not much. Butterfly decline. Hopefully you saw this report that came out this year in Science, rapid butterfly declines across the United States during the 21st century. So they looked at the decline from the year 2000 to 2020 and found a 22% decline in the United States. Here in the Northeast, boy, we have nothing to be proud of, 32.6% decline for us. This has been the poster child for the environment for quite a while, and most people know monarchs in the caterpillar stage are obligate feeders on milkweeds. However, naming other butterflies and what their larval host plants is can be a stretch for many people. How about this little guy? How about the American lady? And other species like this that don't get the same focus. So, this little guy has had a decrease of 58% from 2000 to 2020. So what do we do about this? Well, plant the native plants that are larval host plants for them. And if you've planted Antenaria species, pussy toes, or pearly everlasting, you know that these are really essential larval host plants for this particular butterfly. I see a lot of these butterflies because I have them in my landscape. Native bees, we don't always consider the diversity of our native bees here in North America, different body sizes, different strengths, different tongue lengths, different flight ranges, and so on. In North America, we've got about 4,000 species of native bees. When I was doing research for my book, The Pollinator Victory Garden, I interviewed Sam Droege from U.S. Geological Survey. He's just an amazing guy. And he told me, he said, Kim, about 10% of those 4,000 native bee species we haven't even named yet. Said we're about 150 years behind birders with regard to our knowledge of our native bees. That's changing, fortunately, but still kind of dramatic. Now, keep in mind that about 90% of our native bee species are solitary, with only 10% being social in a limited way, like eusocial and bumblebees that might nest in groups of, say, 50 to 250. They're not social like honeybees. So all these individuals need habitat that you can provide in your landscape. And all these individuals need forage resources, which you can provide in your landscape with appropriate native plants. And then when we think about what they eat, here in the eastern United States, 25% of our native bee species are specialists on particular plants. They're pollen specialists. And if we don't plant those plants, we risk losing both those specialist bees and potentially the plants themselves. We also can consider that 70% of our native bees are ground nesters. Leaving some bare soil or lightly vegetated soil in your landscape for these ground nesters is critically important. 30% are cavity nesting bees, having plants with pithy stems that are still up and available. Chunks in stone walls, great for cavity nesters. Beetle burrows in dead trees and logs. All this is really essential. So All these creatures, they need both habitat and floral resources, and oftentimes we just focus on the flowers. This was a study that came out a few years ago, Pollinators in Peril. You can download that one. And I love this quote from U.S. Geological Survey. Loss of plant diversity is the primary cause of native bee decline. About 30 to 50% of all native bees are highly specialized. So if the plant they rely upon disappears, the bees go away. Fireflies have been getting some press, and rightly so. They're wonderful creatures. 1 in 3 North American fireflies may be at risk of extinction, according to the IUCN. And what are the causes of this? Well, things that we have some control over. Pesticides. Don't spray. Easy peasy. Habitat loss. They're losing vegetation, leaf litter, moist environments. Now, where I live, and I'll just let you know, I live 16 miles north of Grand Central Station here in New York, in a very small landscape. And I am perhaps overly planted. I'd like to call it rewilding. I have a lot of plants, and I have a lot of fireflies, and that's part of the equation. And then light pollution. Keeping lights on at night, just a big old no-no. Get motion-sensitive lights. This whole movement of the dark sky initiative is really, really important, and this is something we can do something about and try to influence others to make these changes as well. It's not just wildlife, it's also plants that aren't in great shape. This is Q's latest study, State of the World's Plants and Fungi. And some of the conclusions they've come to in this study is that 45% of the world's known flowering plant species are threatened with extinction, and 77% of the world's undescribed plant species. I don't know how they know it, but apparently they do. And sadly, plants are going extinct 500 times faster now than before humans existed. We're not in a good place, but I'm here to empower you and hopefully inspire you to make change. Our managed landscapes need to work harder. They can't just look good. They have to work at supporting species, including us humans. So the traditional landscape practices that I still see in great abundance here in the Northeast, these traditional landscape practices often contribute to landscapes that have low ecological value, like this. Anybody recognize this? It doesn't really matter where you live in North America. This is ever present, isn't it? The average American garden. The big green desert, foundation plants pruned into meatballs that nature can't recognize or utilize, maybe a few canopy trees, and just for good measure, we put a couple pots of non-native annuals on the front stoop. We can do so much better than this. And honestly, in my humble opinion, it starts with reducing, replacing, and maybe even eliminating, for many of us, the green desert. It is an ecological wasteland. But whatever green desert you keep because you need a functional purpose that can't be accomplished in some parts of the country with native plants, well, whatever you keep, manage it organically. But be realistic. I mean, you don't need 10 acres of lawn to play or have your dog run or your kids go outside and horse around or play volleyball or whatever. So reduce the green desert and plant intensively with native plants that support the environment. This is such an easy peasy thing to do. I just met with clients recently. They're not ready to make the big plunge to get rid of it all. So one of the techniques I suggest is to build a pollinator island in the middle of this. And of course, once doing that, we want to make sure that no pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and so on and so forth are used on the lawn or plants around the Great Desert. I love this article. If you haven't seen it, look it up. From the New York Times, just came out August 30th. It's a guest essay by Ken Ilgunas. I hope I'm saying that correctly. The era of the American lawn is over. He's a New Yorker who's now living in Scotland, where they have a very different perspective. And one of his major conclusions and comments was yards should be wilder, freer, and more alive. So much more fulfilling for all of us to have that experience. Traditional practice, having monocultures, poor diversity, lots of the same plant everywhere. We just can't do that anymore. Favoring non-natives over natives. For those of you in the eastern part of the United States, you know what this is. This is what one of my instructors many years ago called the vomit of spring. It's Forsythia, an exotic species that provides like nil ecological support, very little. It photosynthesizes, so there's that. We need to make better ecological choices with things like Lindera benzoin, common spice bush. I know it's not quite as showy, but that's, to me, a good thing. But this is a plant that's doing all the things that Forsythia is not doing. It's a larval host plant. It's a forage resource for some early emerging pollinators, and then it provides fruit on the female plants. This is a dioecious plant for birds, a very nutritious fruit, in fact. We do a lot of this, a lot of secret sauce. Sadly, it is easier for the average homeowner to acquire things like Roundup than it is for a licensed professional. So I'm an accredited organic land care practitioner. I don't use any pesticides of any kind. In fact, my book is dedicated to Rachel Carson, who warned us, in the 60s, early 60s, about the harms of pesticides. We do this. We prune everything, into meatballs. This reminds me of the movie Edward Scissorhands, where everything's got to get pruned, prune away. Such an unnatural look, such a constipated look, and such an unproductive experience for the creatures that we share our landscapes with. So, if you're into this kind of thing, maybe you have a few topiaries and let the rest grow to normal shape and size. Putting the right plant in the right place for mature size is a key to this, so we don't have to constantly prune. We've been unwilling to tolerate some messiness, and that's counterintuitive in native landscapes, like this leafcutter bee. Is this leafcutter bee causing damage, or is she just taking the amount of leaf material that she needs to line her nest to raise her young? Rejoice in this. I love it when my clients send me pictures of chewing on their plants with an insect there, to boot. Understanding these connections, these choices that we need to make to let nature survive. It's time not just to think differently, but to act differently. And the time to start is, better 30 years ago, but next best now. So here's some goals that I can share with you in terms of improving the situation in the face of the climate crisis. We want to improve ecosystem health and ecosystem services, those direct and indirect services that a healthy ecosystem provides, as defined by the UN. Clean air, clean water, pollination services, as mitigation of stormwater runoff, and so on and so forth. Familiarize yourself with those ecosystem services that are for humans. We want to increase biodiversity and the abundance of individual species. My landscape's alive all the time, even in the winter. Not as much in the winter, but there's still a lot going on out there. We need to start emphasizing regional native plant species for our local ecosystem support. And if we have a goal, we can't eradicate the impact of climate change, but at least mitigate and adapt our practices and our landscapes to the changing conditions. Every time I look around, there's another pest or disease that's, coming our way. And so we are going to have to be very nimble in our landscapes. More strategies for the climate crisis? Well, increase the health of your soil. This is kind of a basic, isn't it? So we don't always consider soil to be alive, but it is. There are all sorts of macro and microinvertebrates in a single teaspoon of soil. It said that there are way more organisms in a teaspoon of soil than there are human beings on the planet. But we don't often treat our soil as the live organism that it is. And if we have healthy soil, we have improved water holding capacity. That's kind of helpful with flooding. And of course, soil health directly impacts plant health. Healthy soil also sequesters more carbon. And in fact, we've found in recent research that soil contains more carbon than air and plants combined. And mycorrhizal fungi is thought to be a major driver of soil carbon content. So what is that stuff? Mycorrhizal fungi, beneficial fungi that colonize the root systems of plants. Occurs with most plants, but not all. And there are two main categories, endomycorrhizal fungi within the cell, intracellular, and ectomycorrhizal fungi, extracellular. And that's more of woody plants. And so there's this symbiotic relationship. The fungi provides a plant with increased nutrient water absorption and increased protection against pathogens. And the plant, in turn, provides the fungi with carbohydrates. So how do we promote this stuff called mycorrhizal fungi? Well, minimizing soil disturbance, really, really important. Limiting fertilizers, especially phosphorus. Honestly, I've never once used a fertilizer, in a managed landscape. Um, Avoiding pesticides, really important. And planting diversely. Planting diversely in and of itself will help promote mycorrhizal fungi diversity. Don't leave soil bare with an exception. That's another kind of a key point. And the exception would be for these guys. We need to provide habitat for ground nesting bees and other critters that are ground nesters. And I'll just give a shout out to two of my collaborating photographers on my book, the wonderful Heather Holm and Carolyn Summers. And this is one of the shots from my book from Heather. Also, keeping soil healthy, avoid soil compaction. Don't walk on wet soil. So when you're tempted in early spring to get out there and start doing stuff and the soil's still wet, just wait. No leaf blowers, please. Gas is the worst. I'm not excited about electric blowers either. If we can avoid using any of these things, this is a good idea. I've had clients on occasion who have contractors, landscapers in quotes, who come out and do their cleanup. And, I wonder why the next spring, like a certain area of the landscape is like dead. I realize they've been blowing right next to that plant bed, getting whatever it is, the leaves off or cut grass off and just killing plants, killing the soil. So let's try to avoid that. Minimizing soil disturbance and preparing our garden beds through more light touch practices, smothering, sheet mulching, and hugel culture. I love this is a permaculture concept. Mound building. I always think this is great because it looks like you buried somebody in your backyard. It's a very effective practice, and we can, kind of emulate this with sheet mulching. Think ecosystem, not just garden. Your garden is alive, or it wants to be. There's lots going on that really count on you, your practices, your cultural practices, your choices of plants, and so on. We want to encourage biodiversity. And this is a quote that's almost 20 years old, and I still think this is really an important quote from this particular study, 2006. Ecosystems containing many different plant species are better able to withstand and recover from climate extremes, pests, and diseases over long periods. So true. I think biodiversity is the best plant management tool in the face of climate change, in fact. And plant diversity really does equate to animal diversity. And I want to show you this picture. This is in the front of my book, across from the table of contents. This picture was taken by Carolyn Summers. This is Dooryard Garden at the Native Plant Center, where I teach and serve on their steering committee. And this kind of speaks to, yes, can native landscapes look very traditional and formal and organized? Yeah, they can. If you edit, you work hard at it. And here's an example of it. But I tend to take a little bit wilder approach. But if you're in a neighborhood where you've got folks that are a little resistant to more naturalistic landscapes, you might do this kind of thing in the front garden or a riff on this. Emphasizing regional native plants that are regionally adapted to support local ecosystems. We have these intricate co-evolutionary relationships that we don't always consider. Does it matter which liatris, which blazing star you choose based on where you live? Absolutely. You will get more pollinator visits and more variety of pollinators when you choose one that is regional. And I heard that particular research published in the Mid-Atlantic a couple years ago. Native plants support our local ecosystems. It's no longer an explanation that we have to make to everyone. I used to go to parties and people would say, "What do you do?" And I talk about native plants. They say, "Oh, those weeds." Well, sadly, those common names, there are lots of weeds in there, but now people are starting to get it. There's a lot of demand for native plants, thank goodness. And regional native plants are going to require fewer inputs. than other plants, right? And they're low maintenance after establishment, but let's get real. Native plants are low maintenance. They're not no maintenance. Any plant that you put in the ground really needs some TLC, especially in that first full growing season, in order to get well established. And our regional native plants can help suppress invasive plants that don't have the same breadth or depth of ecological services. I once got a picture from a friend. She said, my neighbor went out for a hike and saw this plant. She wants to know where she can buy it. There are lots of bees on it. And it was Japanese knotweed in bloom. So keep in mind, just because a plant delivers nectar doesn't necessarily make it a good ecological choice. Assisted migration, this is a controversial subject, of course. Moving species from an area where a plant, occurs to a place where it does not. Be careful with this. It's tough playing God. I would say favor plants that have a wide native range if you're going to borrow plants from other locales other than your region, your local region. Here's kind of an example of a dramatic approach to assisted migration. These are the Torreya guardians. The Torreya taxifolia is endemic to glacial remnant, the panhandle of Florida, and these folks, they want to keep moving this thing north. And if you look at pictures of this plant, you might have second thoughts. I'm not sure that's the wisest move. But again, being realistic, this is a quote from Tom Lovejoy, who's since left this planet, wonderful conservation biologist. He's often thought of as the godfather of biodiversity. I heard him say this in a webinar in November 2020. Gardening is assisted migration. And that's kind of gotten us into a lot of trouble, with some plants, hasn't it? Another thing, let's minimize carbon inputs. Is this easier? Yeah, but for the green desert that you keep, let's try not to do this. Let's definitely not do that. Gas-powered stuff, let's use people power. Let's pay people to use people power. Cherish leaves. I think of these as nature's mulch and compost. They're a gift. Of course, they don't exist in every ecosystem in North America. So you have to pay attention. Where are you? Well, where I live, it was a forested ecosystem back in the day. So leaves are part of that, that process. But for many of you, that may not be the case. Certainly, leaves aren't really good companions for the green desert. Keeping yard waste on site. And if you've dealt with jumping worms, you know what I'm talking about. Really, creating your own compost and mulch is the best practice instead of bringing stuff in that might be problematic. And enhancing, embracing, encouraging the green tide of change. I gave this picture to an audience years ago and said, this is the optimal amount of turf you should have. This got me a lot of trouble, but I still use it because I think it's funny. So be realistic. Keep the turf that you really use. Manage it organically. Lose the rest. Replace with maybe native grasses, or by a wetland, maybe this stuff. Or a shady area, maybe some native sedges, best interplanted with some woodland wildflowers. Plant some more trees. Can't emphasize this enough. Americans seem to be dead set on taking trees down, hazard trees. Everybody's worried about hazard trees. Well, trees help us fight climate change. They remove carbon dioxide from the air, but it takes a lot of them. It takes a half acre of trees 1 year to absorb carbon dioxide that's produced by a car driven 13,000 miles a year, which is pretty typical for most people. We need more trees. They're also kind of vacuum cleaners, right? Cleaning the air. They're oxygen factories. And said that one mature tree can provide daily oxygen to 4 people. Plant more trees. In my little landscape, I've planted 11 trees, and there were some already here. And of course, helping to reduce energy consumption with trees. Trees properly placed around buildings can reduce air conditioning needs by at least 30%. This is great news. In a single day, evaporation from one mature tree is equivalent to the cooling effect of 8 room-size air conditioners. You get it. You've been in maybe an urban area like this where there are trees that are providing shade and it feels great. And you walk out into the full sun on that sidewalk and it's blistering hot. Trees also help mitigate stormwater runoff. Tree leaves and bark intercept raindrops, allows for more gentle infiltration, and trees themselves hold some water, right, in the root system. So we increase groundwater recharge with trees. One large tree can capture and filter up to 36,500 gallons of water per year. Plant more trees. But let's keep them safe. We need to respect the root zone. So tree roots for mature trees are typically extending 2 to 3 times the diameter of the canopy of the tree. So, when we are doing additions to our homes or work around trees, keep this in mind. That damage that we create can be, pretty far away from the actual tree trunk itself. And most tree roots are in the top 18 inches of the soil. So be gentle. Nix the compaction, the digging, and interplanting large material. And here we again have a bit of an exception to interplanting, right? And this is from Heather Holmes' website, Pollinators Native Plants. This whole concept of soft landings, plantings under trees that are really important larval host plants in particular, right? So when the caterpillars come down, they've got a soft landing, and then we're providing some habitat for even adults to live in. So to create soft landings, I'm using native perennial plugs, not large material, and I'm favoring plugs that are spreading species, so I don't have to plant so much of them and disturb too many tree roots. Keeping stormwater on site, absolutely essential. Again, this kind of looks pretty typical, doesn't it? We don't have to have driveways that are impervious. We can do stuff like this. We can have walkways that are permeable instead of having all this hardscape. And when we have runoff, install a rain garden, or if it gets really serious, you have a large area, buy a retention system. These work, and they're beautiful. And when choosing plants, you might think rain garden and emphasize plants that tolerate occasional inundation, tolerate occasional drought, and are deeply rooted. And when we have any kind of water features, pond, lake, stream, so on, planting riparian buffers to keep that water clean, not having the green desert turf grass all the way up to, say, the pond's edge or so on. This is wonderful habitat and also keeps water clean. And when we're watering artificially, when Mother Nature's not delivering the goods especially, we really need to pay attention to that first growing season after planting. It's really critical. And thinking about watering deeply and less frequently, encouraging root systems to go down and not stay at the surface level, watering in the morning, give leaves time to dry off and not promote fungal diseases, and really favoring soaker hoses, handheld hoses, not overhead sprinklers that waste a ton of water and don't always water what they should be watering. And irrigating in drought. Boy, did we lose a lot of rhododendrons in the Northeast last year in a 2-month drought. People just weren't paying attention. Don't wait until it gets as bad. Broadleaf evergreens, particularly at this time of year, can be really, really susceptible to drought. Emulating natural areas in our landscapes. So as I mentioned, where I live was Northeast deciduous forest ecosystem primarily. And we can take some cues from this and understand why. So there are layers in natural ecosystems. Even in prairies, there are layers. But here in the Northeast, we have canopy, subcanopy, mid-story species, understory, ground cover species, and so on. And from the perspective of birds, different species of birds prefer different layers in this, whole ecosystem setup. So layering, and this even includes your foundation plantings, not having the green meatballs smacked up against the house, layering out, extending the bed lines, creating more layers. And including habitat for invertebrates. Here's another great shot from my book, courtesy of Heather Holm. Thinking about where are creatures living? Well, here's some cavity nesting bees. including plants for specialist pollinators, those pollen specialists, and creatures that really depend on particular species of plants. Limiting the use of non-native plants. We kind of are used to seeing a lot of Japanese pachysandra here in the Northeast, and boy, when I see it in a landscape, it pains me because now it's naturalizing like mad. Doesn't belong there. It's displacing native species that should be there. Let's just not do this. And if we buy a property that has this, well, now we're on a mission to remove and replace with native plants that should be there. Looks can be deceiving with plants. Some of you certainly know about butterfly bush and why not to plant it from Asia. And I had kind of a moment a few years ago when I went to a memorial service at West Point for a family member. And everybody was looking at the gravestones in the cemetery, and I was looking at the plants, including this. It's November, early November, and here is butterfly bush that, with no help from anyone, has managed to reseed itself like crazy and in bloom in November. This is not good when, even if a plant is not on your state invasive species list and it's doing this, it's time to go. So beyond the fact that it's a prolific reseeder, displacing plants that should be there, it is not a larval host plant for any of our butterfly or moth caterpillars. Plant more natives. It's simple. And especially for those of us who don't have really big landscapes, emphasize keystone species, these plants that have an outsized, and in this case, positive impact on the ecosystem that they're in. And here's one where I am, Helianthus divaricatus. It's a rhizomatous native sunflower. I've got it in my own landscape, appropriately planted. And look at this. Don't read all this, right? So I took this listing from Illinois Wildflowers, a perfectly fantastic website that lists all sorts of characteristics about plants, including their faunal associations. Look at this. This is incredible. How many species utilize this plant? It's a larval host plant. One of its caterpillars it sports, butterflies it sports, the ciliary checker spot. It's got nectar and pollen for pollinators, including these beetles. It's ground covering. It has dense habitat. Provides seeds for wildlife. Think about what plants do in your landscape, not just how they look. And these keystone species are very important. So, best practices for choosing native plants, native to your ecoregion, appropriate for your site conditions, and whenever possible, straight species native plants, not cultivars. So let's talk about this. Native straight species plants versus nativars, native cultivars. So most nativars are grown as clones. There is no genetic diversity in clone. Remember Dolly the sheep? And so we have reduced ecosystem resilience when all of us are buying the exact same cultivar. And those patents for asexually grown cultivars last for 20 years. That's a long time. So we want genetic variety, right? We want different genotypes. So straight species natives, you don't have to think about. They're best for genetic diversity. They have full ecological functioning. There's no guessing. And just understand that some nativars don't do exactly what straight species counterparts do from an ecological perspective. Some have reduced ecological functioning. Plants that have nativars, peculiar plant structure, size, foliage color, flower color, fruit size, can really matter to wildlife. Choose wisely. Here is a native Liriodendron tulipifera, tulip tree. Here's a really bad choice. This is a cultivar called fastigiata. I know of some of these and have seen kind of what they do. Yes, they're quite narrow. They get to about 40 feet tall and about 8 feet wide at maturity. They flower. They do provide some nectar and pollen, and they actually do support eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly as a larval host. But what they don't do is provide the branching structure that critters like squirrels, critters like birds need for their habitat and survival. This is a bad choice. Here's Swida sericea. Depending on where you're from in the country, you might call it Cornus sericea, red osier dogwood. It's a lovely plant, great for pollinators, larval host plant, fruit for birds that's absolutely relished by birds. But here's one I just don't use because it's a dwarf, but it rarely flowers or fruits. It's a green meatball. It's an eco-lagger. It's not providing the full function of the straight species plant. Here's another case in point, Hydrangea arborescens. A native hydrangea that is fantastic. These little bead-like flowers are the fertile flowers, all the good stuff, the nectar, the pollen. And now we've got sterile flowers here that are present, but you can see the proportion of fertile to sterile is quite striking. So why then do we do this? Why do we create cultivars that mimic some of the big inflorescences of, say, Asian species that maybe people are more familiar with that have reduced resources for pollinators? Just not one I want to use. Here's New England aster. Fantastic kind of leggy plant. I get it, but an amazing plant for pollinators late in the season. Maybe you don't want a 6-foot aster that shows its knees. So you go to the garden center, the nursery, and you pick up one of these, an 18-inch counterpart, purple dome, and you wonder why aren't there more pollinators on it? Well, your biomass is greatly reduced, number one, but this is a semi-double flowered plant. Less nectar, less pollen, and I've never seen it reseed ever. So not a great choice. So if you are going to use nativars, native cultivars, here's some best practices. Reflect the naturally occurring forms and colors of the straight species plant. And choose ecologically productive plants. There's a lot of research out there on this stuff. So don't take it for granted and just say, oh, this looks good, let's go for it. There are some choices of nativars that are just, in my humble opinion, shouldn't be sold, including some of the really freaky colored coneflowers. Exotic pests are increasing with climate change. We need to be aware. Here's the viburnum leaf beetle, really bad pest on native viburnums. This seems, at least where I am, to have slowed down a bit, but know that we're dealing with some of this stuff, and maybe picking these things off your plants is a worthwhile exercise to keep those important viburnums going. Supporting nature's pest control, our garden allies, by planting native plants. Here's little lady beetle and zizia. There's so many of our native plants that support our garden allies, and we need to include them in our landscapes. And just know that research shows that 90 to maybe even as much as 95% of insects in an average home landscape are either beneficial or benign. The bad actors can be really bad, I get it, but the numbers are on our side. Plant for pollinators for the entire growing season without a gap. Early spring, late fall, and some of you may live in areas that never get cold, so you're year-round planting. Plant for earlier springs, later falls. Why is it so hard to find spring ephemerals like this in the nursery trade? Dicentra cucullaria, a very, very important spring ephemeral for queen bumblebees. So if you don't know what a spring ephemeral is, these are plants that occur in deciduous forests that take advantage of the early part of the year where trees have not yet leafed out. The sun is rather gentle. Moisture is usually pretty good. They come up, they emerge, they bloom, they feed the pollinators that they've co-evolved with, and then they go dormant by summer. This can be a hard sell to clients to say, now these plants are going to disappear by summer, but don't worry, they're coming back. But we need to do this, and it's getting harder and harder to find these plants. Providing sizable floral targets, very important for pollinators. I talk about this in my book. We know through the University of California, Berkeley Bee Lab, that a 1 square meter target of a single species, flowering single species, is a really ideal target for bees. So don't be going to your local plant sale this weekend and pick up one kind of small perennial or medium-sized perennial. Think about creating targets. Very good for pollinators to find, but also very much more appealing from an aesthetic perspective in our landscapes, having swaths of individual species. So we need to plant enough of a given plant, but we also need to plant diversely. this hummingbird is just mad for red tubular flowers in particular. Lobelia cardinalis is a fantastic one for it. It will go to Lobelia syphilitica, great blue lobelia, but I see many more bumblebees on that. So we need to be feeding everybody and consider the species that are sharing your landscape with you or could be sharing your landscape with you. What are their active periods? What are their favored flowers and habitat too? And plant for them. And know that, for example, not all bees are going to be attracted to the same type of flower, right? So we have some little itty bitty tiny bees that have very tiny mouth parts and very short tongues. Maybe don't fly more than 100 feet in their lifetime. Then we get more robust bumblebees with longer tongues that can fly up to a mile. So consider, the creatures and try to plant for them for their entire active periods. Plant more native fuel for fall migrating birds. This is the one I was talking about, Viburnum dentatum. Really, really important plant in the Northeast for migrating birds. Has the right nutrition that they need to make their fall migration. And with our native viburnums, considering the fact that they're not reliably self-fertile and planting pollination partners that are in bloom at the same time, plants that are genetically different, is absolutely essential to getting that fruit. Providing more winter resources for wildlife with things like this, Juniperus virginiana, eastern red cedar. This is a great plant that provides fruit, or drupes in this case, at a time when there's just not a lot to eat. I'm always surprised when we have a snowstorm and robins or similar group of birds come by and just go crazy feeding on these fruits. They act like it's their last meal. Again, understand that not all native plants are self-fruitful. This is a dioecious species, males and females. You need both for cross-pollination, in this case by wind. Leave perennials standing through winter. You've probably heard this before. So do it. Cut them back to varying heights. And leave some of those stems fully standing as well. We really want to do our majority of cutting back in the spring if we live in, a region like I live in New York. But there's a lot that's going on. Lady beetles overwinter in a hollow stem as adults in an aggregate group. Please plant sufficiently. Boy, I see so much of this. Just the, plant mulch, plant mulch, plant mulch. Mulch is not an aesthetic principle. It is a temporary placeholder that we use. We want to vegetate. Better to plant green mulch, living plants, than this. Plant to cover most of the bare soil. So really thick plantings. This is a client of mine in New Jersey. Really suppress weeds, create habitat, and are just beautiful. Increasing connectivity through groups like pollinator pathway movement. I can't recall how many states are involved in this now. I think maybe up to 20. Putting a sign on your property, encouraging others to do the same, getting neighbors on board, getting your local place of worship, your local school, empty lots, and so on. Increase that connectivity. We can do a lot on our own, but we can do a lot more if we're connecting landscapes. Become a climate change warrior. It's a good thing. And I'll quote Voltaire, who apparently took this quote from somebody 100 years, who lived 100 years before him. Let go of perfection. As Voltaire said, perfect is the enemy of good. No landscape should look like this. We are not perfect as human beings, and our landscapes don't have to be either. Just let go a little. Every single landscape matters. This is Atlantic Botanical Garden, right there, urban Atlanta, doing wonderful ecosystem support. We can all do this. So thank you so much. That's the book I keep mentioning and my website, and I really appreciate your time and your attention, and I hope I've encouraged and inspired you to do a little bit more planting this fall. Thank you.
Yes, you absolutely did, Kim. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot, taking notes here. I think with that, we'll switch over to some Q&A. We had a couple of questions from folks when they registered, and I'd like to go through those.
Sure.
Paula asks, what principles should guide us in cutting back or leaving stems and flowers so we can support pollinators and wildlife year-round?
So for most of us who live in areas where it gets cold, right, in the winter, we want to leave stems standing through winter and not coming back in the fall. So we're providing habitat, we're providing seeds for wildlife, and there's a lot of activity in our dormant landscapes. Even if they're sleeping, there's a lot going on in those landscapes. So timing is really essential. We don't want to be cutting back too early in the spring. It's often said that if we wait until temperatures day and evening both are in the 50s, that's kind of a time when insect activity starts getting going. But that's not true for all insects. So I kind of like to take the approach that we hedge our bets. And so in the spring, I wait till temperatures get a little bit warmer, the soil is not mucky and wet, and then I start cutting back, and I do it over a period of a couple weeks at a minimum. This day a little bit, that day a little bit. That way, if we get a really bad snow spell or cold freezing period, we haven't, compromised all the creatures that are out there living in those landscapes. Now, there's an exception in terms of proactive cutting back, and that is to provide excuse me, some stems for cavity nesting, bees in particular. And I think Heather Holm on our website does a really great job explaining that.
Thank you, Kim. So our next question touches on a little bit of what you talked about earlier, but more specifically, what approaches or resources can you recommend that helps gardeners identify these genuine native plants from like what they termed imposters here, or more like cultivars, nativars, things like that?
So, as I mentioned, I always give preference to straight species plants whenever possible. And sometimes they're hard to find, but it's getting easier to find them. There's some online resources that are making even amazing number of species of native plugs available. So if you're trying to have a clue whether this is a good or maybe not so great cultivar, you're going to have to do some research with some of these native cultivar studies. I did a series of interviews with Dr. Annie White when she was at University of Vermont on native cultivars. But again, keep in mind, it's not just about floral resources, right? Lots of plants deliver nectar. Is it flowering at the right time, the cultivar? Does it have foliage that say a caterpillar can actually recognize and utilize? If it's um, say, I'm just thinking about fruit producing plants. This comes to mind like winterberry, Ilex verticillata. There's some cultivars that have oddly colored fruits. They're orange instead of red. I don't want to confuse birds. I want birds to eat that fruit. There's some cultivars that have really oversized fruit instead of the smaller fruit of the native species. You're a little bird, you got a little mouth. You need to be able to get fruit down. So being thoughtful, trying to stick with straight species native plants is really the way to go. And, you know, find native plant sales. They're typically seasonal where you are. Right now in New York, I just spent Saturday at the Native Plant Center sale at a local nursery that we've partnered with, and we sell tons and tons of native plants. So there are lots of sales. Nonprofits are running now. Find native nurseries that really deserve your dollars, that are doing the hard work of growing native plants. And if they're grown from seed, God bless them. Um, please give them your business. And also, you yourself, if you don't have a big budget, consider growing native plants from seed. There are lots of seed sources, including more and more local ecotype seed sources that you can explore and grow from seed. I'll be teaching a propagation from seed class at New York Botanical Garden in November. People are getting really excited about this, and some species are very easy to grow from seed. And then you got a straight species, right? Then you're off and running.
Thank you, Kim. Our next question is from Beth. Should we be considering plant species native to slightly warmer zones for planting now, as in preparation for our future climate shifts? And if so, how can we choose wisely to avoid potential invasiveness?
So as I mentioned in my talk, it's tough playing God. You pray that you're going to make the right decision. So I would give preference to species that have a wider native range, rather than a smaller one. Certainly ones that are nearby natives and not native to some faraway place. and also consider the ecological support that those plants might provide. But I'm one that's trying to really encourage some of these at risk species. And like purple milkweed, Asclepias purpurascens is one that I routinely use in landscapes for my clients because I really want the species to continue going. It's a nice alternative to a common milkweed, which is much more aggressive. So it's tricky. I wish I had the perfect answer, but I think being thoughtful about this is really, really important. Not just saying, "Oh, this one occurs in the central U.S." like Liatra species. I am here on the East Coast. I think it'll be fine. Maybe not. Maybe not.
Our next question, I think a lot of your presentation kind of begged the question, which is how can we balance being a water wise with these native plantings needing additional water, especially as rising temperatures and drought happens, and so yeah.
So, as I said, well, there are a few things. From the get go, right plant, right place. So, we're thinking about drought. We're thinking about inundation, maybe giving a nod more so to rain garden types of plants that have a kind of wider range of conditions that they can tolerate would be, something to consider. But also placing these plants appropriately, taking it seriously that first full growing season of providing supplemental irrigation if necessary to get that system established. If you get a good root system established, it's amazing what some plants can kind of put up with. And hoping that we don't have too many crazy drought events. But, it's last year where I am, we had a 2-month drought. This year we've had like a month drought. I think it's kind of happening. So gentle irrigation, not constant every day, little spritz, little spritz. No, when it's needed. And it would be my advice, just don't automatically have a sprinkler system and set it off regularly. That's really not what I'm talking about.
Thank you. Our last question is from Elizabeth, and it talks about growing in small spaces. So, what advice or recommendations and tips do you have for folks in small space gardening?
Yeah. So it can be challenging. I mean, where I live, I would like to have about 20 times the space that I have. I could fill every little inch of it. So it can be a challenge. So being really thoughtful about your choices, evaluating each plant that might be appropriate for your garden. What will it do? What are the functions that it will provide? And giving some preference to keystone species, obviously, trying to include them. But being thoughtful about the choices. Um, it can be tough supporting specialist pollinators when you don't have a lot of landscape to plant in, but try anyway. I think, many of us can at least get some specialist plants in. I have a very small landscape. I get those pussy toes in my landscape for those American lady butterflies. And I think about all the different species and what they need. And I, try to plan in that. It's a challenge. So emphasizing what I call multiple duty native plants, workhorse native plants that do lots of things well, keystone native plants would be a suggestion, but always giving a nod, excuse me, to succession of bloom in the landscape, uninterrupted, making sure we've got really important keystone species like oaks. I'm sure all of you know Doug Tallamy. I've got some great interviews with him on my website. And oaks are amazing larval host plants. So what if you have a small space and you can't get in, huge white oak or huge red oak? Well, look toward some of the shrubby oaks, like one I have in my landscape, dwarf chinkapin oak. There are some shrubby species that can give you that larval host effect without, overtaking your landscape.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Kim. And I think with that, we should wrap up. We really appreciate you spending time with us today, sharing your expertise, and I appreciate everyone who's joined us for the presentation. So hopefully everybody can gather these ideas and move them forward in our own landscapes and communities. So thank you again, Kim, and have a
Thank
great
you.
day.